Okay, so thank you for coming. It's an unusual setting for an academic, and 15 years, 20 years ago when I started my work in this area, this kind of event would not have happened. The room either would have been empty or we would have had a collection of lawyers and civil servants. So to have an opportunity to speak to a wider range of interests in this area it makes me willing to go through this hurdle. I'm not an innocent party in here. I, in some ways, been a participant in the information of the directive. So I've been at numerous hearings and contributed studies and coordinated letters, tried to facilitate empirical evidence into the policy process. And it's part of our mission at the Create Centre at the University of Glasgow that we do that, so that there's a place in the world where empirical evidence relating to copyright and information law is consolidated and presented in a way that is useful and actionable. We'll see today, whether it helped or not. But before I do that, I want to show you just quickly the website, because it may be helpful for you in the future if you want to keep track on what is happening in the directive space. So this is one of the letters we wrote before the first plenary vote in the European Parliament on the URI report, and where we tried to counter some of the claims which were fictional claims in the debate. But on the website itself there's much more. So that's the page, and you have a timeline, so basically you can follow the developments, and the next 2 years will be critical for the implementation. So while we have now an adopted directive, the way it will turn out in the implementation, there is a wide range of possibilities. So we've got a timeline which goes back a couple of years. Then we've got all the various drafts, so you can track back when the changes were made and sometimes why. You can see where we broadly are in the implementation stage. There are 2 years to go. Then we've got transcripts of plenary debates. Oh, it's not there. Okay, so it should in theory turn up there. It's not fatal. Okay, so I told you what you might see if you go there. So don't worry. But the most interesting aspect of it is that it also contains lists, catalogues of empirical studies that matter to the various provisions of the directive. In particular, the three which have been the most contested ones. So the publisher's right, which was 11, is now 15. And obviously the change of the liability regime for platforms, which was 13 and is now 17. And then text and data mining, we have also a catalogue of empirical material. And we will try to complement and follow the implementation stage. Okay, so I go back to the presentation. So the process of copyright reform started in 2014 at the beginning of the current term of the Commission. So it's 5 years ago. And at the beginning, when the commissioners are appointed, they get a so-called mission letter. So there's a letter in which the Commission President tells the appointed commissioner what their scope and their priorities are for their term as a commissioner. And the two commissioners we're looking at here is, on the one hand, Andrus Ansip, who is the vice president for the digital single market, and Günther Oettinger, who was the digital economy commissioner during the critical time, and who still has his hand on some of the developments, as we will see. So the instruction here, and that's very important, the instruction here is to look at the copyright directive as a digital single market initiative. And if you look at copyright as a digital single market, you would assume it's about harmonization, differences between countries, and about cross-border access. So this is the key to a digital single market. And then we have I assume interventions we have to do with European competitiveness and innovation, so they may have a place in a digital single market as well. And if you look at the brief the commissioners were given, they look probably quite plausible in that context. So the vice president who oversees all work relating to the digital single market, for them, the copyright is merely listed as a part of completing the digital single market. And then for Oettinger, we've got something a bit more specific. So we want the right regulatory environment to foster investment in innovative businesses, and users are at the center of the action, okay? Users are at the center of the action. Okay, so 5 years later, we end up from the digital single market in a discourse which is the life and death of media. So that's a huge jump in narrative and in justification. Many of you in Berlin may have seen this. It's a Berlin newspaper, but this didn't come out of nothing. So the argument here is, unless we get a new exclusive right which allows a certain amount of control over the spreading of online news and monetization of use, there will be no quality press. And the means to do it is create this kind of exclusive new ancillary right. And if we don't get that, journalists will no longer report. That's the story. So how did this happen? So part of my talk today is basically evidencing the change of narrative over these 5 years. Then I would like to talk about the processes and the personnel which were actors in that change. And then I look towards the end on the evidence of lobbying. So, who actually paid for it, who had access, and in conclusion, I would like to offer some thoughts on what follows from that for policy making. And that's the title of my talk. So, is copyright reform possible after we considered the journey we've taken here? So if you came here to expect a detailed talk of a law professor explaining to you the implementation options about Article 13, come 17, we have to do that in a different forum. I'm happy to take questions on that. I will allow quite a lot of time for that. Okay, so 5 years. So the proposal was to complete the digital single market and do ambitious copyright reform. As part of that, there were 3 regulations, 3 directives, 400 pages of impact assessments, and this very long legislative process. And the copyright attorney here, whose tweet I cite, is for the Czech Republic, the copyright attorney on the Council of the European Union. He's one of the few people who communicates a little bit about what's happening in the Council of the European Union. And that's, in policy terms, again, very interesting, because we know what happens in the Parliament to a certain degree. We don't know the lobby transparency, but we can see the documents and the debates. We know a little bit about what happens in the Commission because we can do freedom of information requests, but we have no idea what happens in the Council. Okay, so that is a real gap, and in the European process, you may know that the Commission has is the only institution that's got the competence to introduce legislation. So they hold the original pen. That is the key, and then both the countries and Parliament have to adopt and agree a position which is typically a modification of the original proposal, but it can't change the shape. So Let's look now at the change in narrative over these 5 years and some of the kind of modes of communication developed by various parts of the stakeholder interests of the corporate lobby. So you will recognize immediately again the same image, which turned out not by accident in a German national newspaper, was also in a fake newspaper which was distributed to members of parliament. So this is an initiative by 18 press agencies who try to communicate to members of parliament, that Article 11, the press publishers' right, is essential for them to continue their activities, and to illustrate that, they put together a newspaper which had some of the new narrative. It's not a digital single market narrative. It's not a competitive narrative. It's a narrative about fake news, about democratic values. So a completely new way of speaking about an exclusive right. So move to the next. So this is material of the same kind. So this is also distributed to MEPs to influence them. And here the narrative is European cultures under attack, and we have the American tech giants, and we need to protect ourselves from them. There's a condom which is delivered with it. And then adding to that, in online campaigns, there is then the narrative changes that any opposition to directive, including academic voices who try to help, become recast as essentially financed by tech giants. So any opposition, any disagreement with the provisions and the shape of the directive is then cast in terms of Google and, to a lesser extent, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple. And a graph which has been circulated quite widely is this one here, which tries to show that the online internet campaign, SaveYourInternet.eu, essentially is a fake campaign. So it's not any real concerns there. It's a mobilized bot force by American foundations and tech giants. We will see later on that this was produced by a outfit which itself is financed by the lobby. So it's a curious setting, but it's a very different narrative. So we came from a digital single market to European democratic values, to European culture against appropriation by tech giants, to this story that any opposition to the directive essentially is financed and from far away controlled by anti-European forces. So against this, then was the more and more active, and I would say radicalized, online community. So in Germany it was the most radicalized, and people went on demonstrations, but we also have here, and that interestingly enough, Julia Reda moved with this. So once the basis for the shape of the directive changed, policymakers in Brussels themselves felt the only way they could get heard is playing the same game. So it became essentially a mutually reinforcing game. So rather than looking at what are the right policy measures for the policy aims we agreed to when we started, it becomes kind of a gamesmanship. Who can come up with a more radical narrative, and that's again something I think we should reflect on how policy is formed in this area if this is the only way to get heard. And if we look at the end now, which narrative has succeeded, I think we can be pretty honest about it. I think the successful narrative was this one. So this is the record industry. So if you look through these 5 points, I think this is what got us the directive we have now. It's formulated in moderate terms. It appeals to a wide range of values, and it has little to do with the start of the journey. Okay, so now the next section of my talk we'll look at really the alternatives to this narrative and why we ended up in this narrative. So the end narrative we ended up with is, American tech giants against European culture, and on the other side, I assume we are now, a digital colony of France, which responds to corporate right-holder interests in entrenched industries. So, narratives, here's a selection of other narratives under which, this debate could have been conducted. The first one, is probably goes back to how copyright policy was formed, so I'm not sure it's the best guide, if it's a matter of public interest now. It should not just be a question of doctrinal law, but we need the expertise here. We need to understand, how property rights and how access to information, how freedom of the arts, how these fundamental rights are, traded off, or if they can be. We need, some coherence in liability principles, and there, it's the stuff of many a system of law is to have agreements on due process and contestability. So I wouldn't dismiss the legal discourse, but I can see this is a difficult one to carry, an issue of this gravity. The second one is a social narrative about the changing role of the user, and we had that in the initial, brief for the so a digital user is not the same as we had, a user conceived in law, 3 decades ago. It's not a passive kind of vessel. We don't consume. So it's we live in a networked setting, and copyright law has never accepted this. So this would have been, again, a discourse which we could have used to persuade policy to form in a different way. Third one, cultural. Again, if we look at the initial briefs, they also had quite a lot on cultural heritage and online education out of commerce. So there was an attempt to address a cultural dimension, and there's still quite a lot of good stuff in that area in the final directive, but it was not the prominent discourse under which the directive was negotiated. And what I call here the black hole, again, many in the audience will be very familiar with that term, because the copyright term is life plus 70 years. We get this kind of very strange shape that the works which are available for you to consume legally are either being released fairly recently or out of copyright. And then we've got this whole area in between when works are not available for use, but they're also not on the market. So they're still protected by copyright law, but you can't repurpose them. And then the final discourse, again, I think, which you would expect to be prominently surfacing in this discussion, would be a standard economic discourse about innovations, about market entry, about incentives. And here we've got the curious situation that the digital world is doing fine. So there's more stuff out there than ever before. So for a standard economist, the copyright incentive needs to be treated in a very different way than it has been in the past. So again, I think this would have been a useful way of framing the discourse. None of this has happened. So why? Okay. So when the directive was published in 2016, this was the slide the European Commission put out on their press release. So this sets out, in their most persuasive way, the policy aims of what they try to achieve with the directive. So better choice, access to content online and across borders. So that's very much digital single market. So it's against geo-blocking and, has been met in some ways with the portability regulation and the SATRAF 2 directive regulation, but in fairly, modest terms. Then we've got, improved copyright rules for education, research, culture, heritage, and inclusion of disabled people. Quite a lot of this found its way into the directive. And then we've got, the fairer online environment for creators and the press. And, nobody can disagree with this. We all want to work and invest in a fair environment. But what does it mean? It's, it wasn't there in the initial brief. So what does it mean? And, well, it turned out to mean, I jump quickly forward, it turned out to mean a industrial policy measure. Essentially, what hides behind the fair marketplace is the idea that there are certain European sectors of industry which need the help of additional rights and rules. And this was driven by Oettinger. That shows you how important it is that whoever holds the pen in the first draft controls where we end up. So from the digital market narrative, we ended up in a narrative of industrial policy, at least for this third bunch of rules. So if we look at this, it looks pretty innocent. It looks also something most societies would be happy to invest policy in. And so, unsurprisingly, it's also not that far away from the radar report of 2014-15. So this was a report which reviewed the InfoSoc directive. So before this directive, the last important horizontal measure in the European Union was the InfoSoc directive of 2001, which implemented the WIPO treaties and also kind of to a certain extent harmonized exceptions, at least the ones that are possible. And so what Julia Reda suggested in her report, which was accepted in a modified form in the European Parliament, was really that we need a rebalancing of the copyright space with a greater focus on users and with a greater focus on reuse and a rebalancing of the underlying deal. So from the radar report to the directive, so the big change is the one which I indicated just a minute ago. The big change is this addition of industrial policies supporting particular sectors. And the two provisions, most of you in the room will know are the which have been the most controversial. There are others in there, but the focus of the public debate mostly has been on these two. It's the new exclusive rights for press publishers, and it's the change to liability regime for platforms. So I speed up a little bit. So this will go in more details in the next 3 slides to what the European Commission said they would do to achieve those aims. And I don't think I have time to talk you through this in detail. I just stick with the third one. How did they want to do their industrial policy? How would they, use intellectual property rights to protect or incentivize or shape certain cultural sectors in the European Union? Well, they say here the new rules proposed by the Commission reinforce the position of right holders to negotiate remuneration for their creative content. So we introduce new rules which improve the bargaining of right holders. It doesn't quite say how this will happen or who against, but this is really the underlying motivation. So industrial policy here is designed to improve the bargaining of right holders. So apart from Oettinger, who drove this agenda, he famously encouraged also the right holders themselves then to control the public debate about this point. So, which is a very interesting, again, for the change of the narrative and the way the directive has communicated. The traditional political class still consumes content and news through traditional media, and the traditional media had a stake here. So because of that, the reporting on the directive was either not existent or often biased. And in this famous intervention in 2006, Oettinger basically told the publishers, if you want this right, you have to tell your online journalists to shut up. And again, if you want to change the way policy is made, this is a problematic intervention. So the second big player is Andrus Ansip. So he, in the beginning, really stuck to his digital single market brief. So that geo-blocking, not being able to access content across borders, is one of the big issues. And also, he talked up the economic and cultural value of digital heritage, museums, libraries, film archives. and he made strong statements that hyperlinking would be protected. So he stuck in his rhetoric very much to the original brief. But as we moved through the legislative process, and that's again typical for European policy making, it's better to have something than nothing. So you're not seen as a success if your proposed legislation doesn't get through the process. So towards the end, UNCIP more and more became really a force in pushing the directive forward. And then we have got the situation in the European Parliament. So in European Parliament, we had a change of rapporteur. So the rapporteur is very important. The rapporteur is basically the negotiation position between the Parliament and the other European positions. So again, he's effectively the person who holds the pen for the Parliament. I indicated how important it is for the Commission who holds the pen. For the Parliament, the pen is held by the rapporteur. And there was a change in rapporteur from Therese Comodini-Caccia, who was a Maltese MEP from the same party, also from the Christian Democrats centre-right. And there was a change to Axel Voss. And that changed completely the way the directive was handled. So in the draft, which Comodini-Caccia prepared, the exclusive rights for press publishers had disappeared, and the filtering obligation had been qualified. So we had a completely different situation until Voss came in. And through freedom of information requests, we know that at that particular stage, there was a meeting between the chief executive of Axel Springer, Oettinger, and Voss, which is a quite an unusual situation for policy of this type, that you bring essentially people who are on different sides of it in one setting. And what we've seen afterwards really shows that the industrial policy took precedence. From then on, this was what had to be in the directive. And then on the outsides, we have Julia Reda up here, who was the shadow rapporteur in the Jury committee, which is a formal role, and Catherine Steeler, a Scottish Labour MEP, who is the chair, was the vice chair of the Internal Market Committee. And for Article 13, they had joint competence with the Legal Affairs Committee. So in some ways, she was on the same footing as Voss for Article 13, who became 17. And that was an important factor in the vote last July, when first the mandate was refused to Voss to go ahead with his draft. Okay, so that concludes the second phase of my talk. So we've now looked a little bit at European processes and the kind of people who have driven the adoption of the directive. So in the next section, I want to look at what we actually know about how lobbying has taken place and how it's been shaped. And I rely in this very heavily on a report written by Corporate Europe, which is a campaign organization which is funded by donations and 12 foundations, and normally focus on finance and agriculture and food and trade issues. And they also write, other reports on where the influence of lobby on legislation needs investigation. So they wrote a report last December on the copyright directive. And it's insightful, and I recommend you to read it. So essentially, I start at the top here with the conclusion. This lobby battle over copyright is one key example of how aggressive lobbying by competing industries often crowds out other voices and successfully distorts the public debate. So we have seen already that the discourse moved. The discourse moved from digital single market to tech giants against European culture. What Corporate Europe suggests is essentially what we have now is really a competing lobby battle between two different corporate interests. On the one hand, we have the back catalog right holders, mostly the music industry and the publishers, and on the other side, we have the tech companies, and they are both legitimate corporate interests. And by structuring the policy and the lobby as a competition between these groups, the other voices are being drained out. Okay, so we no longer hear from users. We don't hear from startups. We don't hear from smaller companies. We don't hear from independent artists. It's all wrapped up in a binary structure. And they reviewed a number of freedom of information requests to the Commission, and also interviewed members of Parliament, and also accessed information through a number of different ways. And what I show you here is basically the result of a freedom of information request to the European Commission on meetings they held with lobbyists which dealt with copyright. And the results are really striking. For anybody who has been in the copyright world for a while, this is it's no surprise at all. That's how it is. So the top is the record industry. Then we get the publishers, and then we get the trade body of the collecting societies. And that's how copyright policy has been made for the best part of the last century. But interesting in the context of how our narrative has evolved, the narrative that essentially policy is controlled by American tech giants, this is a different story. So Google is the most prominent of the tech giants here, 22 meetings. Then the next on this side of the corporate battle is a trade organization, Digital Europe, which comes in with a mere 11 or 12 meetings. So if you consider the lobby environment, how influence is being exercised on the pen who writes the directive, this suggests that what we have received is very much a draft which reflects the corporate lobby of the content industry and not tech giants. And even more disturbing are the next two. So if you add up the interventions, the most important, or the most, let's say the institutions with the best access to the Commission are music collecting societies. So we're not talking about, copyright covers games, it covers films, it covers, software. Music is an important sector, but it's not even the biggest nor the most important in most countries. But in copyright policy, it drives what we receive. Okay, society is shaped by the interest of one particular sector, and here we've got the collecting societies added up from SACEM France, PIS UK, and GEMA for Germany. So these are the three biggest ones in Europe, and we have obviously the umbrella body for them. And if you add up their meetings, they've had meetings 54 or something like that. So if you just look at the amount of engagement and access, they are at the top. So, and these are the consumers. Okay, so that's the users which we are supposed to be at the center of the way copyright reform should have been addressed, and it's a poor show. It's a poor show. It's one organization, which is the European Consumer Association, among the first 36. So now we've looked at the evidence on lobbying, let's look at the evidence on the evidence. So what do we actually know about the empirical basis for copyright policy and copyright reform? So if you look at the material we supplied into the policy process, there is really a consensus, at least on Article 11 and Article 13, what the studies have produced about past implementations of the publisher's right, and what we know about the function of the notice and takedown system. There is a lot of empirical material now of the highest quality which is available for policy making, and the research centers, my colleagues and I, are pretty clear, what the directive is doing, particularly on the industrial policy side, is entirely misguided. And so the evidence says that copyright remains out of balance, and what I told you about the lobby makes this unsurprising. We still have this black hole. There are some measures in the directive that makes it a little bit better. We have overall a redistribution in the copyright system from the living to the dead, which cannot be the aim of copyright law. From the living to the dead means, that because you've got life plus 70, and the estates and the best known works tend to be the most valuable ones. Any extension of copyright term leads further to a redistribution of money from living people to essentially dead people. The empirical evidence is there. The role of the digital user is misunderstood. So there's a lot of studies from sociology, from communication science about the changing use. All this speaks very clearly that the current balance of copyright law is not right. And on the two most controversial provisions, the evidence is also very clear. There's no indication whatsoever that the proposed new right will produce the positive results it's supposed to do. It will, it's very unlikely that money ends up with journalists. It's very unlikely that the amounts of money which are being raised will transform the fate of the quality the press. The most likely effect is that entry into the market becomes more difficult. And on platform regulation, the picture is much more complex. So platforms need to be regulated, and one of the difficult questions is how to distinguish what is needed in the copyright space with measures in other spaces, whether it's fake news or whether it's terrorism or security or pornography. There's a whole range of other conceptual frames, and the law struggles to offer a coherent kind of view what liability of platforms should look like, and how we deal with essentially a dominant market situation under which competition law can't quite work out how it deals with vertical integration and acquisitions. So on platform regulation, the empirical evidence is not as clear, but it is quite clear that we know now for over 10 years how notice and takedown functions. We have, through experimental tests and also through the review of databases, the Lumen database, and also Google transparency reports, we have a much better understanding how the notice takedown system works, and who falls out, and what are the effects for the kind of content we assume. So the empirical evidence seems to suggest we need a better notice and takedown system. We don't really need an inversion of the liability. And the way the directive is framed, the key decisions on how this will work out are really in the implementation stage, and we can discuss that in question and answers if there is an interest. So, to conclude the talk, so when the directive was finally adopted, this was the tweet which came out of Jean-Claude Juncker's office. So, the digital single market is finally being completed because we've now got the copyright directive. Clear rules will guarantee fair remuneration for creators, strong rights for users, and responsibility for platforms. Well, what you heard from me doesn't suggest that's the case. In the adoption of the directive in the Council of the European Union, there was a dissent, which doesn't happen very often. So there was a statement issued by the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Poland, Italy, and Finland, and it's worth reading. It's worth reading. It more or less, sums up what I just explained to you. How we ended up in a situation which is, in many ways, against the purposes of the policy that was started in 2014. Okay, so I think I conclude my talk with allowing you to reflect on what you see rather than read it to you. Thank you.
Okay, this is quite something to digest, I think. Thank you, Martin. Questions, remarks. Music industry lobbyists can contradict now.
Sure.
Are they here? No. Okay, no.
Hello, I'm not a lobbyist. Can I ask you a question about Article 14, which concerns visual works of art in the public domain? In the German context, how do you see that being implemented, where here the restrictions are quite tight and organizations have been able to maintain control for remuneration and other purposes, and how do you see the future?
Well, I mean, that was a late addition, and in some ways a surprise that we managed to get it in. So saying I would say so those group who took seriously the initial aim of the directive, putting users at the center and also releasing the potential of culture. So if we look here, I don't have much about it, just that works of visual art in the public domain. I mean, the idea here is that by digitizing you can't assert a new layer of rights on out of copyright material. And that's again, I think, an example where, if this is a harmonization measure, you would have to treat this in the same way in all countries of the European Union. And many countries have different layers on rights relating to photography as well. And then there's a separate layer of rights, for example, in Italy, which give a sui generis protection to culture works. So it's very enough making that statement, but how it ends up in practice is. I still think it's a good thing to have it there as an aim. But I would not be able to predict, in the German context, how the implementation would. I mean, you can't just take the right provided in German law for photographs away, because it's a different type of right. It's not covered by the directive. So it's a problem. Yeah.
Another question over here.
Hi, I actually have two questions regarding Article 15 or before Article 11, and they are kind of connected. So. There was a conspiracy saying that the real reason for Article 11 is to shut down the small newspaper pages, or by shutting down Google News completely, so that the users have to visit the large corporate news websites not through Google but directly, and so they can have a much more market share regards of advertisement. Is there any evidence that this could be the real reason? And the second question is, which is connected, is there a legal instrument that can actually force Google to shut down Google News if they say reduce the news they show on Google News to the legal free minimum, which is, in my opinion, just the headline with a link with no image.
Okay, so I just don't subscribe to conspiracy theories, and as you can see, if you empirically dig, most of the time there's evidence there. Just look for it. It may be hard to get it out. But I agree that the publisher's right is a puzzle. I wrote a study with Lionel Bentley for the European Parliament on it, and we reviewed the evidence on the implementation in Spain and in Germany. And it is very hard to work out why it is there. What would this new layer of exclusive right, what would it really produce? We know that in the German context it hasn't produced much, very little. Still, it's become kind of an article of faith, and it's very hard to work out what it can't be the direct financial benefits. It's very unlikely, and in particular in the version we have now, which the version now still permits hyperlinking, it still permits individual words, it still admits short extracts. And then we've got the Berne Convention, which got Article 10, which permits quotation. So so there's the argument here. Okay, this is an ancillary right, doesn't fall under the Berne Convention, but still, it seems very, very strange that the Berne Convention specifically, speaks about press summaries. It's there. Press summaries are permitted. You must permit press summaries if you're a member state of the European of the Bern Convention. So this tension has to be reconciled by the courts at some point. We need to know whether you can just have two different laws there. We have to understand whether what is a short extract. So I would expect, that some kind of meaningful aggregation service is still possible. It's still possible on the text we have in front of you, but much will depend on how it's translated in international law, what the role of collecting societies is, and I think it may be true that for Springer, Springer is very well positioned for digital markets. And it could be that for Springer, it is a benefit, to control who else comes into the market. Possible, and the evidence the only evidence I presented you, and the main evidence which is there, is that Springer was a key policy player in this. So we should ask Springer why they have it. Okay. So the second question, remind me briefly, was. Okay, I answered that. That's fine.
Hello, Dominique, my name. I used to be the data analyst in chief for DigiCom and later for EPP Group, so I can assure you that the whole online narrative of how this took a turn was definitely flagged to the commissioner and Axel Voss, and they were very surprised about what happened online. But I have to flag that Julia Reda, Axel Voss and Günther Oettinger are all German speakers, so the whole discussion about this is completely different in other countries. And I think we will see what Günther Oettinger's underlying intention was when he actually leaves office and what position he will assume afterwards, because I think he will go private industry. So that will be a lot more exciting to follow, and then we see what happens. So it's more a statement than a question.
Thank you, anyway. More questions? Oh, I see one question over here.
So maybe a follow-up to your answer about Bern and whether or not this is compatible with Bern. There's been some talk that maybe this isn't compatible with CETA and maybe not compatible with the e-commerce directive because it imposes general monitoring duty. Do you think that people are just grasping at straws, or will these be viable challenges?
I think it's part of the mix of uncertainty. I mean, there's some tensions. That the Canadian Free Trade Agreement with the European Union has mentioned specifically the e-commerce directive. And so the integrity of it in some ways needs to be preserved. And so that's. I don't see these as stumbling blocks. I think I see them as sand in the grain, which will feed into the implementation. I would say. So if we look at the implementation phase, and we talked a little bit beforehand. So what will happen now? Because we can't have 27 or 28 different regimes within the European Union, they have to come up with a regime under which this switch in liability is translated in something that can be processed. And so the most tricky question at the start is so yes, we have an obligation that we now have to license. Okay, so we know now if I start a platform, within 3 years, and once I reach 10 million euros turnover, I have to license the stuff which users upload. So do I need to license everything everybody uploads? This could be anything from a game to software to a clip of text. So that the first question is, who do I go to? Okay, so who do I get a license from? In many cases, there will not be a ready body or license holder I can ask. It's in music, no problem. In music, I know where to ask because they're organized. But in most of the interesting internet innovations, it's more difficult. So then I can't track them down, or I don't get the license on the right terms. So then the next step is I have to then. If I then don't want to be liable, I have to go through 3 steps. So I have to exercise best efforts, firstly, to locate, have to evidence that I tried. And then I have to respond to take down, essentially. So if I get a notice, I have to do what I had to do under the e-commerce directive. I have to take it down. And if it's supplied in the right form, I have to prevent it from going back up. But that means that the information has to be supplied in a consistent form. So we need a database of stuff which, then, feeds the filter. And that's when, the freedom of expression and meme and discussion really kicks in. So how the licensing regime will evolve at the national level is completely unclear. It could go in very, very different ways. So I think the two kind of legal kind of problems you stated, I think they're real ones, and how general monitoring obligation can't be imposed. It says in the directive, and also it says in the e-commerce directive. So it has to be a specific monitoring, the specific monitoring linked to these databases of rights supplied. So the shape of these databases is absolutely key to answering it. So putting this point in, may shape the national implementation in a particular way. But how do you shape it at European level? I mean, we can't have 27 different kind of takedown regimes, stay-down regimes, filtering regimes, licensing arrangements. It's not digital single market.
I think we can allow one more question. Come on, guys. One more answer is provided if you want to. Okay. Otherwise, thank you so much, Martin, for this really deep, insightful talk.
We will